super excited here to be hosting this panel along with the Heavybit team and, of course, with a stellar group of folks who have one thing in common, which is that they have seen the journey from no revenues to one and then more, over the course of sort of a rapidly accelerating revenue curve in startup, but more specifically in startups which are started by technical founders and which oftentimes sell to a technical audience. And so, that is why the Heavybit community is very relevant. And it is also very relevant for what we do at Vertex Ventures, where a bunch of our investments are in enterprise infrastructure software and data infrastructure software and security and the like. So with that in mind, why don't I just kick things off with a quick round of intros. My name is Sandeep. I'm a partner at Vertex Ventures. We've been around in the US for about 6 years. And we focus on seed and Series A investments in early stage software companies. About 50% of our investment dollars and time is spent in infrastructure software and dev tools. And we've collaborated with the Heavybit folks in the past on companies, and we're excited to be doing this panel together. I'm joined here with Betty Junod, Rajoshi Ghosh, and Jake Randall. Betty, I'll actually sort of pass the baton to each of the speakers to introduce themselves. They'll do a much better job of it than I do. And so I'll ask the ladies to take it away, and then Jake gets to bring up the rear.
Great. Thanks, Sandeep. So hi, I'm Betty Junod. I'm currently the Senior Director of Multi-Cloud Solutions at VMware. So I've recently gone back to Megacorp, and it's also interesting as a company as we're reinventing ourselves for a multi-cloud world from different from where we came from. But I along the startup spectrum, I was at Docker running product marketing for about 4.5 years, from 100 people to 500. So that's an interesting journey. And then after that, I went to Solo.io, joining shortly after Series A. So I was the first marketing hire, and then I left right after B to go to VMware.
Wonderful. And so, Betty, you would say that you're sort of more a product marketer in terms of sort of your perspective and the role in this conversation?
Yeah, so I've spent probably the last 10 years focusing on product marketing, but I've throughout my career, I've actually spent time across all the various marketing functions from various programs and such. Granted, some of that program's knowledge is old at this point, but then the most recent is all in product marketing, and it's Solo being the only hire in marketing at that time. Pretty much did a little bit of everything.
Wonderful. Rajoshi, over to you.
Hey folks, really happy to be here. I'm Rajoshi. I'm the COO and co-founder at Hasura. We are in the data access space. So, when you're building applications, data can be across multiple different places. Hasura sort of comes there, lets you connect to different data sources and gives you an API out of the box. We are an open source startup. We started about 3 years ago. Today, we just crossed 100 people, I think, last week. So, and we're distributed across 5 continents, many time zones. I spend majority of my time in the community and marketing, looking over the community and marketing functions at Hasura. Prior to Hasura, I ran a technology consulting firm for a few years. And prior to that, I was actually in genomics and biodiesel and like bioinformatics and very different things. That's kind of where I come from.
Wonderful. How about you, Jake?
Hey everyone, thanks for having me here, Sandeep and the Heavybit team. So Jake Randall, I've been at Okta for 10 years now. So I started at Okta when we were 30 people and had no revenue. And now I think we're close to 5,000 people. And I was just looking actually, so I don't get in trouble with our IR people or legal. But I think we did 57% growth last quarter, and we're projecting, or our guidance is 1.2 billion this year in revenue. So it's been quite the journey. I ran a lot of things early on. So everything from legal. So I'm not a lawyer, but I did run legal for about 5 years, but mostly really partnered and was responsible for our go-to-market strategy and operations, getting to where we got to. Also ran enterprise sales for a bit, and now I run our SIAM business, which is one of our 2 main product lines at Okta and comprises about a third to 40% of our business.
And so, just as I asked Betty, her perspective is more marketing, but perhaps a product marketing bet in recent times. It feels like with Rajoshi, it's sort of marketing, but more sort of community and sort of demand and, on that side of things. And Jake, would you say that your experience is perhaps more on field operations and
field operations,
sort of
sales,
right?
Absolutely.
Lovely. Very good. I mean, I just wanted to level set that, that the perspectives that each of the panelists brings is not just, from their different companies and their different journeys, but also from the fact that they have sort of different perspectives on sort of the go-to-market functions within a large organization. And so the way we've structured this panel is that there's basically three sections. First we'll talk about sort of how to build excellent go-to-market organizations, and then we'll talk about, how to set the right goals and metrics and recruit and retain people, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to bring alignment amongst the various functions within the go-to-market teams, to actually make a company successful. So with that, why don't I sort of set the stage, right? Which is that obviously, we see a lot of startups and you guys, each of you panelists also advise and work with a lot of startups outside of your existing companies. And, everybody wants to do, developer-led sales and product-led growth, or whatever the, acronym du jour is. And, the big question is, if developers just like I tweeted about, right? You build a great product, you tweet about it or get it on Hacker News, and then you make money. Isn't this how this actually works? And so, I mean, what do you guys do basically, right? Why is it even important to kind of do what you guys do? I mean, that's kind of the meat of the conversation here. So, given the technical decisions are made by developers, right? What role do you feel, right? Especially for folks within, who are sort of starting out with their first company. I know that we have members in the audience who have also built and scaled public companies in open source. How, if all of this is self-service, why do you need a sales and marketing team? Betty, would you like to, what do you guys do?
Yeah, I mean,
Jake, what do you do? Rajoshi, what do you do?
Yeah, I
just do webinars and joke around all day. So.
That's what I'm doing. Yeah.
We just send a few tweets and it's all done, right? So anyone can do that. No.
Tweet to IPO.
Yeah, tweet to IPO. There we go. We can do that as a service even. There you go. New company idea right there.
Right.
But I'd love to kind of kick off this, answer that question just from as a marketing person. Oftentimes, I know that there is a little bit of a challenge in thinking hey, it's a very technical product. It's a developer-led motion. So, we don't need marketing. Marketers don't understand, right? And I want to put that to rest, because I think it's, with marketing, especially from a product marketing perspective, it's about taking how does this thing work? How is it designed? And then helping turn that into messages and content and things that can then be consumed by a broad audience, right? I think what often happens is the people who build it know it intimately, so they talk about it in one way with the known context. But then for someone who's never touched it before, tried it, so many of that context isn't there. So it's really important for the people who are, and marketing is a broad term. People who are writing stuff on the website, how the demos are architected, how you are explaining what it does, and what is the ideal use case, right? The first user experience you want them to have in the first 10 minutes. That is really where I think, especially folks like product marketing, can bring a lot of value, because what we want to do is ultimately help scale the vision and message and what the founder is building into something that it really sounds authentic from anybody at the company, right? And is easily understood by, someone who's never seen your product before.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I can maybe try to provide a sales perspective also on it. So, so what just quick context, when I started at Okta 10 years ago, right, product-led growth wasn't really a thing yet. I mean, cloud was barely a thing, to be honest, right? We could just talk about those stories, as I'm sure everyone on this call could. And over the last year, I spent a lot of time on our acquisition of Auth0. which was a developer-led motion, right? And so Okta was traditionally the tops down enterprise sales, right? We're just going to bludgeon you until you buy something from us. Whereas Hasura was more of this PLG standpoint. What we found putting it together is that, and this is probably where we're all headed with this, but like you need both, right? At some level, I think of PLG as like a great new, like we call them like product qualified leads, right? So there's like traditionally like the MQL, the marketing qualified lead, is a whole new channel of how you can think about getting people into your funnel and thinking about you. But at some point, you want your customers to, think about your business or your product in a critical way, where they want to be able to talk to someone. They want to be able to call in. They want to know that if they're going to go to production and be spending millions of dollars with you, and that if you go down, their service goes down, that there's a face to that, right? It's not just there's some forum. And I think that is just like people, can tweet about things and get interest. That's still a people business. It's just there's a tweet to it. But I think at some point you still want to be able to connect, and you still want people to feel confident. And trust is a big part, I think, of any sale, and that's ultimately where your sales team comes in if you're doing their job correctly.
With Rajoshi, you guys have an open source community, which is like a different sort of like product qualified lead, because somebody could literally download stuff off of GitHub or off of NPM and then start using the product. So how does marketing or sales work in this context?
Yeah. I think you could have a great product, but without distribution, there's only that handful of people that are going to hear about it, right? And I think that's the piece. Like, distribution is marketing, and a lot of times when you speak about marketing, especially to developer audiences or to technical founders, the definition of marketing can get confusing, but it's really that distribution aspect, right? So I think the first part of it is, when you launch, you go up on Hacker News, GitHub. We went through that journey, and that's great for the initial eyeballs. But you're going to have to learn from that, and you're going to have multiple product launches throughout your journey in a company. And so to be able to what you do is you kind of keep getting data driven, and you sort of learn from how you're doing things well, so that you're able to strategize and prioritize better. Because in the beginning, there's one product and a few a tiny set of things that you're talking about. But as you grow, actually, there's a lot. So to be able to strategize and prioritize keeps getting much harder. So that's on the marketing piece, like the distribution factor and the data-driven aspect to make it more to help prioritize both, for the entire team. And the sales process, what we've learned and what we've seen is that you need sales if there's complexity either in the product or in the organization structure. And I think that's the aspect. Developers could adopt your product and developers could, use it. But for that to actually make its way into an organization and for you to make that sale, you have to navigate. And especially with, first-time founders or, technical founders, people might not have seen that, right? That navigating that organization structure can take a really long time and a lot of following up and perseverance, which you might not have experienced before. And so having that sales team or having a sales mindset is going to be very important to navigate that. So yeah, sales and marketing, extremely important.
Yeah, we talk about, I love that point, just to echo it. I think there's this element of helping people buy is sometimes what we call it, right? Where your average developer, this might be a generalization, but yeah, they can put something on their credit card or like do something like light and easy. But at some point, they aren't thinking about how to get a, $1 million PO cut, right? And so how do you help them with that process? How do you help them build a business case? How do you ultimately really get your product ingrained in a complex organization? That's where I think a great sales team that understands that motion, right? That's a really critical thing can help.
Oh, and I have Sorry,
Sorry,
I wanted
go
to
ahead.
add
No, go
one
ahead, Jim.
point, Sandeep, in that, and I want to give an example from Docker, right? At Docker, it was a tremendous amount of developer pool because it was so easy to just download, use, and get going. You build a container, and it was great for, and many developers paid for like the $5 a month to get the private repo. Not a big deal, right? And so but what we found is, and this is really important for founders of developer tools, is that developers are building apps, but ultimately those apps need to run in production. And production systems, then it's no longer that laptop. It's no longer that $5. If you're a developer and you happen to work at a bank, you have all these other things from a compliance standpoint and security checks and all that stuff. And that's owned by a completely different team. They have all these different like SLAs and all these things they have to do for their cloud environments, their data centers. We're talking server storage, networking, a whole bunch of other jazz, gateways that the developer, honestly, they don't have to care about, right? Because their scope is to like build the business logic. So really from a marketing and a sales team, what they can do is like, how do you, if you want the adoptions bottoms up, but then to make it a sale that's sticky, ultimately needs to run in a production environment. That's the part that marketing and sales can do, is how do you then navigate the rest of that sale to make sure that it lands there. And that's usually where you can get some big dollars. When
we've sold the big banks, with the technical win, it takes literally, I've had 9-month negotiations with, legal. They're like, hey, we want this. Like, we're ready to go. This is going to do all these great things for our business. And it's going to take 9 months before they actually sign something because of all the SecOps and all that they have to go through. And that's something that, you can't solve with a tweet, I guess.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think you guys brought up two things, right? So I think one is that, moving from a developer's experimental project to actually pushing something into production is something that a solo developer doesn't decide by themselves. So they might swipe a credit card and get started with Docker Hub or with Hasura's cloud offering, or perhaps some offering from Okta as well, or certainly from Auth0, right? But then when it transitions to production, then there's a business context around it. There's a team that depends on it. And so all of a sudden the decision maker is no longer an individual, but it's an organization. And there are multiple people who are different stakeholders in the decision-making process. And so that's what I heard from you guys. And so there's two things, right? So one is sort of the process, which is the sales piece, which is how to navigate all these people and security and compliance and departmental issues, and finding out who the decision maker is. And then there's also the messaging, which is like, hey, the messaging that resonates with the developer is probably not the same messaging that resonates with the director of SecOps, which is not the same messaging that resonates with like the VP Eng, who might be the ultimate decision maker. So it would be great, for instance, for you guys to take perhaps like your first customer or second customer, one of the first 10 customers in any of your journeys from 0 to 1, to talk about how you guys learned and navigated that as an organization. before there was like a seasoned sales playbook, before there was a seasoned marketing playbook, right? It would be lovely to hear examples and anecdotes, because I think that it's hard to generalize, but I think people can learn from the anecdotes. Right, who wants to go first?
I could start with, I was just thinking that we actually, one of our early customers did come from a tweet. Right. Somebody had tweeted.
There you go.
So just to wrap it back to that tweet thing, right? But that was a startup, so it was a very quick, it was a quick win. But I think in terms of the larger organizations, it was an insurance company that we started off with, and we already had a technical win. This was when we did not have our, we had our open source product. There was no sign up process. So people had already downloaded it, installed, started playing around with Hasura, and the technical win was there, right? And that being one of our earliest sort of enterprise users, we thought that's it, it's done, the job is done, right? But that involved, I think the whole process from when we first spoke to them to maybe closing the sale would have been 9 to maybe even 12 months early on. And with multiple, at some point, there was, I think my co-founder actually went it was an in-person meeting with a CTO who was not even directly involved in the in this
Office.
product line or this business unit, just to kind of like, because it's also a startup. So you're dealing with multiple levels of things like, hey, so you're sort of socializing with some folks. Then we had suddenly like way into the journey when they had already started using it in production, there was suddenly like a question about competitive, the competitive environment and how we compare to some of the other players. And then we had to run a whole bunch of benchmarks and sort of come up with that. So there was lots of things that just came at us, which we did not see. It was not a like, a logical linear path, right? Because the technical win and all of that was done. So it took a really long time, and people kept getting thrown at us from different departments and different functions, and we just had a lot of conversations. The one thing that we knew is we had our technical champion, and through all of this, and this was before we had a sales leader or anyone, right? It was just the founding team. And so we made sure that our technical champion was always happy, right? Like we made sure that there was somebody always looking at our technical champion while we were doing all of these other things. And then finally, like, the deal did close. And then that nurture process and that education process that happened for such a long time that became like our fastest expanding deal. And that sort of expanded to multiple teams. And then they're one of our largest customers today. So it started off with that community technical win, but it was a very long navigation process through the org.
Jake, how was it for,
a couple things. First, I'm trying to remember what was happening 10 years ago. I was clean shaven, everything. No, I think one thing I just want to highlight, kind of this point of like where a sales team comes into play is like that trust that you were just hearing about, right? At the end of the day, particularly early on, what you're almost selling is like the founders and like their vision, right? And that's something that you have to, whether it's your founders or your sales team, like that is an in-person conversation or a Zoom conversation or whatever you want to call it, right? And so just to I think that's a really important point to kind of tie it into the prior conversation we were having. The other thing I'll say, thinking through, I have all sorts of funny examples. It's really just like, or anecdotes, it's that flexibility. And I guess some of the other buzzwords I've learned throughout PLG is like first principles thinking, right? Like you just need people that are going to go figure things out early on, right? And that they're going to navigate, and you don't, by definition, really have like product market fit almost at that point, or use another buzzword. So you need folks that that thrive in a non-structured environment. Right now, Okta is at like $1 billion per year, and growing at 50+%. Like we're highly structured, right? It's like you do this, and like there's boxes being checked, and there's I's being dotted, T's being crossed. Early on, it was like, I don't know, just go have a conversation and figure out can we help them. And if we can help them, then get our founders involved so that they can, to the point we just heard, so that they can trust Okta and feel good about things. And then once we got there, there's all sorts, I was thinking through memories, like I have memories of, one of our first larger deals, and like we'd have a security addendum to our MSA. And they're like, well, we need a security addendum. How do we know that you're going to, how do we know what you're going to do? How are you going to encrypt our data? How are you going to do this? What's your, do you have a SOC 2? Do you have like, go through the list. And we're like up at 3 a.m., writing a security addendum from scratch, right? Here you go. Put it in the back of the MSA. Right? Like you get into also crazy stuff like that to make it work. But I guess just to highlight it, I do think it all is that point of trust, right? Making people believe that vision and go from there.
No, so does the messaging have to be different for different people? Like Betty, since or Jake, because like what you're selling, the value prop that you're selling to the developer seems very different to the value prop of like whoever it is that is one of this many stakeholders in this complex decision making, correct? And like how have you seen it? How have you seen technical founders navigate the fact that they have to change the messaging, and that talking about the awesome features of or the high throughput of like whatever database is not going to cut it, basically, with some decision maker who has perhaps other concerns and is thinking about it in a different way?
This is actually kind of funny because I literally just wrote a blog post in part with Heavybit on messaging to users versus buyers. Is it different? And I think there's been a few, it is a little bit, but I will say they're connected. right? Because at the end of the day, especially now, because the world has changed a little bit. If you said 10 years ago, are people really caring about developers and what's happening with developers from can they recruit them? Are they happy in their jobs? Are they productive? I'd say maybe not as much as they do today, right? With the whole, I hate this buzzword, digital transformation. Every company is a software company. They do care. And they, CIOs, CTOs do care about, do they have tool sets that make their developers super happy to work there? They feel like they're working on exciting things, bleeding edge stuff, et cetera. So they care about that, but how they care about that really comes down to like things like simplicity, speed, those types of things. So whatever, at the end of the day, the messaging is how do you make a person's life better in the time that they spend logged in at work? Because these are all, oftentimes tools that, change their day-to-day workflows. So going back to like that use case, right? What is the canonical first use case that you want to go out to market with? It may change over time, like Rajoshi was saying, but like there's that first thing, and that's the vision behind why you built the thing, right? So if you map that out, you can say like, Sandeep, this is how I'm going to change your life with this. You normally spend this usually takes you like an entire day, but I've got it done so that if you set it once, like it's just the click of a button every single time now, or just one command. And then if you look up to like, okay, so then if you look at a development team, what does the manager care if that happens? Because how often does this workflow happen, right? And then if you look at all the way up to like, let's say an executive, if you have thousands of developers in your organization and this thing in the workflow is something you have to do all the time, what is the impact on that for your time to market, your delivery? How much does that, how much faster can you go to market and start making money? Because that's effectively what these apps are going to do. And are there other side benefits to other teams because this workflow is fixed? I mean, it seems super pedantic to say like, it's one use case. And, founders are visionaries with like big, audacious, like goal dreams, right? To say one use case seems like, come on, don't minimize my thing, my baby to be this tiny thing, but really landing that, a consistent thing to be your point to test and go from helps.
As well, sorry, go ahead.
No, please finish, Jake.
I was going to say, just to give like a tactical example, I think this is a super interesting topic. We will often land with developers, and the developer will say, hey, I have XYZ thing that I'm being asked to go code or whatever, and this makes it easier for me to do it. And then at some point, in the case of my product line at Okta, we have to go sell to like the CTO or CPO. And how we actually, we have also some ROI tools we've developed over the years now. And one of the things that we'll actually quote sell is essentially to this point of but basically developers are a hard hire. And so by doing this, you don't need to hire more developers. And I think that's a really interesting way to think. The developers, this makes my life easier. And then the way you actually get a check signed is by saying you don't need to go hire more of these people. So you could almost argue that you're trying to put the developer out of their job. It's not actually true, to be clear, right? And we would never say that, nor is it actually the case. But that dichotomy of how you're thinking about selling to those people, to your point, Sandeep, I think is a really interesting point around that messaging changing.
I think what I wanted to add is in that 0 to 1 phase, right, which is usually that the founding team is heavily involved. The single message, the single use case that Betty was talking about is super important because that also heavily ties into the developer experience, right? So we had instant API on Postgres, super specific. I mean, that was everywhere. And that was really helpful because developers knew exactly what they were getting, and it was that single use case. And but as we navigated the org and spoke to different people, I think in the early days that's where the vision actually works. I mean, there is a vision, right? There is a vision behind that product. You talk about that vision to the developer, they're not gonna care too much. They're like, give me the product, let it work, give me an example, let the documentation be good. Right? You may have the best vision, your docs are bad, I'm not going to touch your product, right? That's the developer. And so that's important. But you do have a vision, right? And that vision sort of in that early phase, that trust and that vision is what kind of is that piece with product marketing that gets you to that 0 to 1. But then being able to ensure that can sort of scale up is sort of that 1 to N is sort of, when you're really trying to, build playbooks of this and sort of, make it something that can scale. People can come in and sort of deliver that message and whatnot.
Yeah, the vision is like the big promise, right? And then that use case we talk about is like, and here's the step one towards
here's the wedge,
right?
Here's the wedge. Here's the wedge, so that somebody becomes your champion in the first place because they've got a burning problem to solve, and the wedge solves that problem. Yep. And then for the larger decision maker who's trying to decide, hey, do I partner with this company? Is this like, is this a critical strategic piece of my infrastructure going forward? That's when you're having a platform conversation, and you're tying the roadmap, you're selling the vision, and all of the other pieces apart from what you just have today. You're selling more than what's in the truck. You're also selling what's coming into the truck, basically, next year or the year after.
And to tie it back to I think it was our first conversation, but like that's also, again, this is like where a good sales team can be really critical, right? Because you get that wedge in with the developer in the example we're using, but the developer is really trying to solve X, Y, Z. And then with the sales team can go figure out, well, what else is going on in this org? What else are your problems? Oh, I can help you with that, right? Which then, depending on where you are in your journey, becomes either, if you're later on, bigger deals. If you're earlier on, it becomes like, here's new product lines we can start thinking about. Here's new ways we could start positioning our business, right?
So then, awesome. So now we know why go-to-market teams need to exist for dev tools companies to succeed and scale. So with technical founders, like, I mean, what is the first like skeleton go-to team look like, a go-to-market team look like, or kind of who should the first go-to-market team hire be? Like somebody in community, somebody in sales, somebody in marketing, and at what level? I mean, it might be hard to generalize, but you guys each work with a bunch of companies other than your own as well, and so would love to sort of hear a perspective on how that first team gets built.
From a marketing perspective, when I talk to a lot of founders, they're like, should we go with a product marketing person first? Should I go with a growth marketing person first? And, this is a personal opinion, but I always think that you go with someone who can do messaging and content first, because it's, you got to know what you want to say before pushing it out on all the different channels. Right. And so, and this goes, I've had this conversation back and forth where is it really a product marketing person? Because sometimes many product marketing people tend to be a little more broadly scoped. They've had like a variety of different marketing experiences in there typically, or they've collaborated with like other marketing functions, so they understand them to be able to direct, like, let's say, a contractor or an agency. I waffle between that and sometimes of a DevRel type person. And I think that's where it depends on your product, and it depends on kind of like what your 6 to 12 month goals are, because you want to align the hire to that. Because if it's more like, if you want to make splash in market, do things like press releases and that stuff, I'd say more product marketing. If you want to focus on pure just adoption, all right, and maybe not so lead centric, and you just want people using and trying, then I'd say much more DevRel, because they will they're going to work on like the actual like developer experience part with the product, and can also do content. To get the first champions excited about your first wedge, basically, right? To bring us back in that case. What should the characteristic of the first sales hire be like? This is perhaps a question for either Rajoshi or Jake.
First of all, I'll say I think Betty's answer was perfect. So I'm glad you changed the question, because I have nothing to add. I think in the first sales hire, I kind of maybe already mentioned this, but it's like that kind of first principles thinking type, right? Like, it's even if you do follow Betty's advice and you hire a great, kind of person on messaging, or a product marketer or whatever that ends up looking like, even the best one won't get it perfect. It won't be right. And so you need that salesperson who is just, I think, a bit more technical, right? Because you're not going to have, so it's like really clear, you're not going to have like SEs and everything yet, probably, right? So like, you have to be technical. They've got to be able to kind of talk the talk a bit, and they've got to be able to like navigate, right? And I think there's this phrase, called audible ready, right? Like someone who can just get in there and like when something weird gets thrown at them, they're like, all right, cool, let's go over here then, right? Whereas then over time, you end up saying, no, like here's enablement and like you just do this, right? And it becomes a bit more of a machine. That's a generalization, to be clear.
Got it.
So yeah, I think it's just that like a bit more technical and first principles thinking. They're not going to be stuck in their ways.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's I think because I think the early sales leaders, there's a lot of figuring out that's happening right during this time. You're kind of figuring out the pitch, you're figuring out pricing, right? You may want logos, you may want to kind of heavily discount things for to get a low. There's lots of things that are being navigated in that phase, and so I think that first principles thinking to be able to not be very rigid on anything right is very important, because if you are, then you might not discover the best path forward.
Agreed with that. Yeah.
That makes
It's that market development we just talked about. It's a lot like you're doing a lot of, I'll call it like education cycles versus sales cycles early on, that hopefully at some point will turn into a sales cycle. And so how do you get people that are comfortable with that? I think there's a whole other topic we could have around, not like your first salesperson, but your first, couple or dozen. Like there's also comp philosophies I think are really critical, because if you as the founder or whoever is kind of administrating that are too rigid on that side of it, you also can run into all sorts of issues there, because you don't know yet. You don't know how to set quotas. And you don't know, should you focus on logos or whatever. And so
exactly,
right. And so just like make people happy. Like, hey, you're doing a good job, right? You didn't hit the totally arbitrary quota we set for you, but like you love what you're doing, so like you're gonna get paid, right? And like don't get too stuck in those ways too. I think there's a lot, we could have a whole other webinar around like
I think that's really good advice, right?
Because that's a great one.
Yeah, because everybody actually was just kind of like, because everybody knows that, so much quota is required for like a sales head who's this expensive, or for
I mean, like I know at Okta, like we ran the numbers. Like if you lose an enterprise rep, like it ends up costing you with both like ramp for the new rep plus opportunity costs. It's over $1 million. Right? In cost to your business. And so like, don't be, foolish, what's the, cut your nose, spite your face, or whatever saying you want to say there, right? Focus on the long-term goals and get people feeling like they're part of it and that, you have their back.
Yeah, it's a great point about just you're figuring it out. So just be flexible and focusing on, it's not, you don't know exactly how much you're going to, especially if you're going into a new market, which is what we found with like, especially at Solo, like service mesh. It's so new. Containers are even like, we're just about to get to like, we're at year 7, right? 7 or 8 on containers. So like service mesh is so new that what was great is our founder said in the beginning, he's like, I want for our first year having product is like, I want like, X number in production. Right. And some might be paid enterprise customers, some might be open source, but we're going to learn so much. So let's just make that happen.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that organizes teams well.
I had a conversation with a company that I, kind of advise or whatever, and they're trying to get one of their first deals through procurement. And it's a 6-figure deal. And I'm like, just like, who cares? Give them for free for the first year. Like, you really care, right? At the end of the day, if you get a bunch of companies that are using your product and they're like, yeah, we'll pay you in year 2, someone like Sandeep will write you a check if you run out of cash. Don't worry so much about like, monetizing everything. Show success. There's a lot of things there that you can start talking about. And then to the point, I was just thinking, it's funny for me to actually think about 10 years ago. I don't do it often enough maybe, but like thinking about quota setting, what is now a very small fraction of Okta's product. Initially, we went to market thinking we could get $20 per user per month. We now sell that product for like $1 per user per month. So if you just like apply that, you're like, whatever quotas we thought someone should be able to carry 10 years ago, we're definitely not. If we were thinking they could sell it for $20 and we're selling it for $1 now, right? So like, there's also stuff like that you can think about and figure out.
So how do you think then about sort of going from that sort of one person in sales, one person in marketing, like, how do you think about sort of scaling your respective orgs? And, what is the right time at which founder decides that, what I have today with my first salesperson is working out well. Now it's time to scale the organization. Do you have sort of rough MRR metrics or ARR metrics that when you think about, hey, now it's time to like size up in marketing, and now it's time to size up in sales or in DevRel? I'm just kind of thinking about like when should founders think about scaling this go-to-market function?
I'll take a crack at it. I think there's a lot of focus on demand that you should look at, and not marketing. There's other ways.
Interesting. Explain. Talk about
yeah.
That.
So and I'll give two, there's two different versions of this, right? So at Okta, it wasn't that we had like a ton of pipeline, and so one version is, and like you talk to companies where like we just can't process all the leads, right? And you're like, yeah, like you're behind, right? Like you're way behind. Like you got to go hire people, right? So there's certainly that aspect, and keeping an eye on that. And I said, it sounds like I saw you kind of nod your head. Yeah, I get it. But like you'd be surprised how many companies are like, oh, what happened here, right? I mean, how do I scale that up? I think the other side of it is, and I'll give Okta's example, which again was more tops down, because it was like 2011, 2012. But we figured out that, and this is a really hard conversation with our reps, but the standard conversation with your sales team is like, oh, like you're cutting my territory. How can I generate more quota? Well, the reality is focus drives a lot of execution, right? And drives results. And so we started figuring out that by actually cutting territories, that meant that our reps could therefore have better conversations, have more focus, and in turn drive more demand and more sales, right? And so I think that's really interesting. I bring that up because that for me is a demand conversation, but it's not a marketing conversation. It's not a lead conversation. It's a, how do you make sure that you're getting into the right conversation and work a bit harder, and close more deals, right? How do you make sure you're getting into those accounts? How do you make sure you're having the conversations that you need to have to drive your business forward?
That's right.
And you have a lot of levers at your disposal. It can be DevRel, it can be whatever traditional, you can do webinars, you can do whatever, right? But figuring out that, and you feel like you can scale it and get a repeatable result.
Yeah.
Betty,
how would you? Yeah, sorry, Rajoshi. How do you think about growing? How did you guys?
No, I think I just wanted to add on to what Jake said, because that's very in line with how I was thinking about it. That early on, when you have lower MRR, you kind of focus more on that community function of like, that's basically generating that demand, right? And once that's there, when that checkpoint is there, that's kind of when you start staffing up your sales team. So maybe not exact numbers, but just as a, first community and, leads marketing, whichever way you want to go, whether you're top down, bottom up. And then when there is enough of that is kind of when you really move towards sales.
So now segueing for a second, then, so let's now talk about like, how do you manage folks within the sales and marketing team, and how do you learn to set the right goals and metrics for these individuals? Can you guys talk a little bit about like, how you guys have onboarded new hires onto your team, or have you seen it done, at a company where you were early on, right? Like what are some challenges that you faced, and what made you, like, what breakthroughs or realizations did you have that made you successful at onboarding somebody in a function which is, sales and marketing, which might not be like, naturally what you as a founder or an operator were good at, like, in the early days, right? So talk a little bit about that. How do you onboard somebody new?
What's interesting is sometimes at startups, it's like you're a lean team, right? You're going so fast, everyone's doing everything, that you don't always document stuff. I mean, I could say like that's probably just something that none of us, we don't do well in general, right?
I'm saying I never document stuff. Like, never document.
I will say though,
it wasn't just me.
I know. I will say though, I think the biggest thing that I did for my own like scalability at Docker was to actually build a And it was a simple document, even it was just a Google Doc, but it was like because otherwise people are like trying to figure out who to go to for what. And it's not even just an org chart. When everyone's wearing multiple hats, how do I figure out this thing that I'm supposed to learn about and then do some marketing on, right? So even just simply like don't expect them to do anything the first week, but instead in your first week, like curate the list of like videos and talks they need to watch, the demos, because there are demos. It's just don't say go watch our YouTube channel, but curate it. And then have them say like read very specific things. Like I have, it could be blog posts, press releases. If you've already done messaging, yay, go read it. And then sit in on if there is a sales call, whether it be founder led or if there is a salesperson, go sit in on a customer meeting, right? Go sit in on some of those. And then actually have some very clear actions for them. Like when we do our one-on-ones, bring me your list of questions. What are some things that didn't seem right to you, right? Or practice giving me the pitch, or evaluate the, you read the messaging doc. So, give me your opinion on it. How does it answer these things for you? If you make it almost like a research project for them for that first week, going and watching a certain set of competitor talks, that kind of thing. And then making it very engaging as a manager to them. I think that's the thing, it may seem simple, but especially for marketing people, because you need to ingest inputs from all these people to then author something new. I think that's an important exercise.
I'll just say, I'll just add one thing I'll say is I think as you start to scale up your team, frontline sales managers, I think that's like one of the hardest jobs there is, to be honest. Anyone who's been a frontline sales manager, kudos to you. Like, because you're smack in the middle of it all. You've got reps, you've got to enable, you've got management hammering you on what your commit is for the quarter. You're not getting, what you think you need from PMM. No offense, Betty, I'm just joking, right?
Healthy tension, Jake. Healthy tension.
I would say that as you're scaling up, really making sure that you're thinking about what you want those frontline sales managers to do and what their responsibilities will be. And it's almost more like a cultural hire in that regard than like a tactical, tell me about your biggest deals you've closed. Like, what culture do you want that manager setting, and how do they think about their responsibilities to onboard? Because you're not going to have like a formal sales enablement team. And even if you have hires from someone from sales enablement, or like you don't really know yet, right? So it's about those managers taking them under their wing, shadowing calls, and that kind of ad hoc enablement, which is basically what Betty was saying. I think becomes really critical, but you need people that are going to own that and understand that versus thinking of it as someone else's problem.
I think something that we found really helpful to sort of tell folks, especially when you're in that phase, right, where, things are not probably as well documented as they should be, is to pull. And I think that's a very underrated I don't know if skill is the right word, but to just get people to pull, like whether, if sales doesn't feel like they have a deck that they're happy with, to sort of like really like pull from folks. And I think that's something that's very important and has had a lot of positive effects that we've noticed. Just side note from it just reminded me that's a very, and maybe for, founders listening in, I think that's probably something to just also tell folks that, in that chaos, the best way to manage a lot of chaos in an early stage company is to be unabashed about.
So raise your hand. Raise your hand
exactly.
And say, hey, I need help here. And this kind of goes into what Jake was talking about, culture as well, which is that the sales manager doesn't have all the enablement tools, doesn't have the right marketing materials from PMM. They don't have everything. They've got to kind of create something, and they need to know how to kind of ask and be resourceful. And I guess that's where being a first principles thinker helps as well.
One of our great sayings we had, I mean, we still say this, but early on it was like a mantra almost, was we win together, so don't lose alone.
Ooh, I like that.
And I think if you can embody that early on, that's really helpful, right? It's like selling's a team sport. Everyone should be selling, right? We would get engineers on calls if we needed to, right? Everyone had to be out there comfortable doing that early on. And then two, which is kind of what you were saying, is like, and raise your hand, right? Like if you don't have what you need, don't lose alone, right? So
So I'm going to ask like a tricky question, which came up in the audience Q&A. I really like it. Which is, so when would you fire a first line sales manager or a director, basically?
I would say it kind of goes, I would say there's two things. One, there's so many variables depending on where you are. That's why I'm hesitating. I'm like, I don't know. Of course. Give me a situation, right? So I'm trying to figure out how to like generalize some of the things you might be thinking about.
But at what point are you as a manager of this sort of sales manager, like thinking about, hey, this is not working out, or this is not
got it. So one thing I'll say, and like not to keep, but like I think, and like kudos to my friend Adam Aarons and Perry Germain, who are our first sales leaders. The culture is such a critical thing. I would say like more than anything early on, if you just don't feel like they're like, I don't know, they're not the kind of cultural person that you want, you need to like nip that at the bud quick, right? Because I think that a lot of Okta's early success was driven by the culture that our early sales leadership set. And if that had been different, I'm not sure we would have ended up where we got to, that kind of like escape velocity. So I'd focus a lot on that, right? Because like if people believe and if people love their manager, right? Like I firmly believe people don't leave jobs or companies, they leave managers, right? So that's the first thing I would think about. Hopefully that's almost like it goes without saying, but I just like, I would want to highlight it, right? Versus like, I don't know, they're not making quota, right? Like we've already talked about that. Quota is going to be a bunch of DS anyways. I think the second thing would be early on as a sales manager. I would say that I kind of said it, more comfortable than missing quota or whatever. It's are they coming to you with not just the problems, but do they have proposed solutions? It's kind of like first principles thinking concept. I think you had a lot of folks that early on could be like, well, I'm not getting whatever messaging that I need or whatever. And you're like, okay, well, like, what do you think we should be saying? Don't just bitch at me. Sorry. Right. But like, right. Like, so you need people that are going to try to drive things, that are going to come with solutions that are going to be really clear on what you need to do to move the ball forward, and focus on, if they're bringing that feedback, then there's a path to hitting these arbitrary quotas potentially. Right. So.
And I'd say, Jake, that's something that's across the board for every function. It's like,
in like every stage of your company, to be honest.
Yeah, because even for marketing, it's like, well, we're not doing this, we're not doing that. I'm like, well, but tell me more about what should we be doing? What do you see? Did you see something awesome that one of our competitors did and said, like, you know what, that's a great idea. We should do something like that, but I want to add this flair to it or whatever. But it's those are the people that are going to be the ones that can help scale you forward too, because they're going to be creating more opportunity.
Yeah. And like, I think like we always have this kind of like, we'll never fire you for trying something and failing, but like we will fire you for not trying and failing. Yeah. Right. Like if you just sit there and like, you're like, right. Yeah, like if you try something and you're like, that was a terrible idea, but at least you tried and like we learned from it. That's fine.
And you had an idea.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, and so this is actually this sort of a good segue into sort of thinking about sort of alignment in that case, right? A lot of this, Betty used the word constructive tension, I think, right? Like, which defines sort of this sort of bottoms up developer-led like journey today, at least in modern sales and marketing teams, because on the very end, you have sort of the big deal enterprise salesperson whose job by definition is transactional in the sense that they have to get this transaction over the finish line within this deadline to kind of meet the company's objectives. And at the very opposite end, there's sort of the relationship and sort of the developer love and sort of the DevRel, right? And I guess marketing is somewhere in the middle. So you can almost think of this funnel, where there's a lot of like, DevRel love here, which translates into sort of more concrete messaging and needs, and which ultimately translates into sort of a transaction for now, right? The commonest question that we hear across our like DevRel focused companies is like, hey, when should we mine the community for leads, and when should we mine the community for for prospects, for leads that become like, and how pushy should we be with leads to kind of make them into sales to kind of meet the quota. And it feels like that is a natural tension, in sort of this category of companies. I'm curious, how you guys have thought about using metrics or data or other things to resolve the tension as to like, hey, when is somebody ready to be approached by marketing, and hey, when is somebody ready to be approached by sales, and like actually convert it into a transaction. And yeah,
I mean, so go ahead, Rajoshi. You start.
No, go.
So, I was going to say that I think it's different, a little different now than when, in the early days over at Docker, there was kind of like open source and community stays that way. And then we have this enterprise thing that's separate. But part of this also goes back to your product design, right? What is the break between what's free, what's open source, and then what's paid, right? Do you just have a free tier, or do you have like some free features and some, paid features? I think that'll help dictate it, right? Because then the path you talked about, community to like some leads to top-down sale, I don't think it's linear. Basically, all motions can be happening at the same time because you're likely talking to different people. One, you can get the developers to be interested and playing with it, but then passively present them the opportunity to let's say, join the Slack channel, like ask questions there or give feedback. And for that, you want to measure different types of metrics: number of people that start signing up, and the amount of engagement. Right. So that's different, right? You may want to look at like how many people from the community are actually filing issues, or, making even simple things like corrections to your docs, right? Because I found this other thing, I'm going to add it here. So those are important engagement metrics. Then if you have a passive contact us for help, or, sign up to do the paid, like the trial of the paid product. So that's a pathway. And then the other things could be much more, because it's more top down, you can do like more the traditional demand gen type things, or ABM or whatever, to then, and if they answer a lead form, well, yeah, you can be as pushy as you want because they raise their hand for someone to call them.
Yeah, I think what I was going to say is, on the alignment side, one thing that's worked well for us is just having that, even if it's a very rudimentary, the funnel, right? Like, what does your funnel look like roughly? Like Betty said, it's not always linear, but it's still like there is a process, right? Like, when does somebody join the community? Like, when are they trying it out? When are they evaluating, right? But having a rough idea of the funnel with all of the different ways in which they're linked is a nice way to align everybody, not just sales and marketing, but like, product engineering, everybody, to know how are people discovering your product, right?
Yeah.
And I think the way that we do it is like, I think it's a conversation to make sure that, especially if you're a developer first company, like even if sales is reaching out to you at some point, it's a very educational, helpful kind of message. We're very careful about how we word our emails to developers, in a way that we're saying that, hey, if you need help, if you want to raise your hand, we're giving you this opportunity. But you define certain boundaries. For instance, for us, we have our community newsletter. So in the community newsletter, you have things like webinars, and your typical demand generation events are part of that. So if you opt into one of those, you're sort of switching over from community to the marketing funnel. You're kind of raising your hand.
Got it. You've
raised your hand, right? Until you raise your hand, you don't get anything that, you don't get any kind of marketing emails. So you can create those, right? You can create those. And then from marketing to sales, how do you reach out? What is the thought process? Do you want to reach out by saying that, hey, would you like to speak to an engineer to help you solve XYZ problem, which doesn't sound very salesy, but that might be the first touch point if it's a large enterprise. You don't want to do that for every company because it's how much time you spend. But sort of defining those boundaries and kind of also having, I guess, very clear the messaging for different categories of companies and types of folks you're reaching out to helps sort of keep this pretty clean.
Got it. We're at the 1 hour, 5 minute mark, and I wanted to encourage the audience who might have questions to kind of start streaming with some questions. I've already asked a couple from the audience so far, but just encouraging the rest of the audience. While I have like a whole bag of questions here, like that I have myself to ask, and we'll keep going through those otherwise. So that sounds about right. I mean, do you feel like in terms of making so we talked about sort of alignment across sales and marketing and sort of community. We talked about sort of the types of early roles, first principle thinkers, et cetera. Could you guys sort of reflect on sort of what does it take, you think, and we talked about onboarding. How do you think about sort of up-leveling sort of the leadership teams, at these companies, correct? Like, because you're oftentimes, the person that has taken you, and you might not have examples like from your own experience, but you might have worked with other companies. How do you sort of encourage folks that have been part of the journey to say, hey, look, we need to bring on sort of more horsepower, or like, the VP of sales that we had, or the VP of marketing, or the VP of product that we had from 0 to 1 is not sort of the same one that we're going to have from like, from sort of 10 to 200 perhaps, right? And you guys have been in the roles yourselves, right? And so you've kind of seen and felt it as well yourselves. Like, how have you thought about what is the perspective of somebody who sits in that role, right? To think about, hey, this is my contribution so far, and and I feel like founders oftentimes hesitate on this issue because it is a very emotional and sort of personal decision, right? And so, how do you think? What have you seen as best ways to do it? Perhaps is a good way to phrase that question, right?
So I'll say I think it's really important. I mean, I think being clear as to what you think the company needs to take it to the next level, and having that conversation with whoever's in the seat today. And I would argue, like, assuming they're doing everything well, like, you should give them a chance. I think that's like where you then get into like a cultural issue, which we've talked about as being really critical, is like when it's just kind of like out of left field, and like it's like you're done, right? And you're like,
there's no expectation.
What do you mean? I've been hitting quota for a lot, right? Or like I've been hitting the pipe gen targets. I've been doing whatever. Correct. So like, correct. Hey, and I think what's hard about that is often what you need. Maybe it's not that you're not making quota. It's like that we need someone that's thinking about these things or pushing us in this way, right? I think that like it's often not as like maybe quantitative, I guess would be the way to say it. It's like more qualitative. But I think starting by having the conversation, here's what we're looking for, give them a shot. Hopefully you haven't waited so long that it's like a do or die situation. Hey, we'd like to see more of this. Let's talk about this. It's not like a PIP or whatever, performance improvement plan, but it's like conceptually kind of like that, right? It's like, hey, I need to see this. And like, we want to give you a shot, and assuming you like them and like you want to keep them around, you just want to layer them. It's like, and if not, like, we want you to be involved in the hire, right? So to make sure you're comfortable with it. We love you. We don't want you to go. We kind of, but I don't know. I think communication is both the easiest and hardest thing in a lot of situations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say sometimes you get, when you're going from like seed to A, or kind of in that phase, or in the early phases of A, oftentimes you see like a director level being kind of a first hire. And then it's like, as they go to the next stage, right? Do you level them up? Or do you bring in someone who's been at like a much larger organization, so they can, like Jake was saying, they know to think about all these other things, further out on the roadmap, and then can kind of backwards map that for the organization. I think that's really common, because sometimes to have someone, super high level too early on is not good, because you're not going to get, you want to just get, there's a lot of like just getting it done that you want. So you want someone who's got their hands in. 100% agree that you should give the person a chance. It also depends on if you're bringing in like a director level hire, is this someone who's been a director for a while? So they would have naturally, they're at a point where they're thinking about leveling up.
Thinking about their career.
Yeah, or they a new director, because then they need time to grow. But if you see the potential and you see that they're proactively bringing you solutions and ideas, so you see that, there's sparks of that. I think it's up to the founder to also then lean in with the board and get them mentors, right? Because the board has access to other executives, ones who've taken companies public or what have you. Like it is, I think one of the things that happens is because, we're scrappy, we're doing this, and everyone's kind of going for it, that you forget that, it is still very much the job to, like, if you like these people and they have the potential, you have to cultivate them. And if you can't, you have other folks in the network who can help them out.
That's right. I mean, part of it sounds like then it's about sort of the career trajectory of the individual tied to the trajectory of the company, right? Like, if you feel like this individual is growing as faster, right, than the company, then there is opportunities to sort of have them grow alongside. And if on the other hand, you feel like, okay, they've kind of reached a limit where you want somebody with, somebody with experience, like for instance, I don't know, I probably could help, like, any of your companies, with probably like the first 5 sales, like, actual sales, but there is no way that I would know how to like do what Jake does, which is like, manage managers of like salespeople, basically, right? Like, it's just that my career hasn't like afforded me the experience to kind of do that, right? And so it might be time to kind of think about, hey, who thinks about those different perspectives in kind of, I think that's very helpful perspective. On the flip side, right? As you sort of think about sort of scaling the organization, right? You're also kind of thinking about fundraising milestones, and you're kind of building the product and building the company as you sort of go along. Can you talk a little bit about, like, what have you guys done, or what have you guys, especially in the 0 to 1 journey, how have you communicated the overall company goals and broken it down to, folks in sales or folks in marketing or folks in community in a way that the broader company mission is digestible and, and is translatable to folks within your sort of functions? I'm curious.
Like a shot.
Yeah.
So I think there's companies have OKRs, and if you've ever worked with anyone from Salesforce, they have their V2 MOM structure, which they all talk about all the time. But I say that jokingly, but I think it's great, and Okta has a version of that. I think it's really clear to early on not just have, like, again, the quantitative OKRs or whatnot, right? Like, it's like everyone knows that you got to generate this much pipeline, or you got to sell this many things, or you got to like ship this product, or go through it. But how do you set out a cross-functional vision that is compelling, that gets people like fired up, just like call it what it is, right? Where you think you have this like common thing that like you can all go drive at, and everyone understands what they're doing to support it. And it's not just to go hit the sales targets, but it's something bigger, right? It's something that is like that rallying cry. And I think that's what, I think that's a good leadership, I guess, in a nutshell, is finding that larger topic that's going to motivate people, and make them see the purpose in their day-to-day, work. So it's not just a job, right? Because I think we all know, having worked at startups, that like, for better or worse, it's a lot more than a job, right? And how you make people feel that way.
Yep. Anybody else would like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think it's, at a company level, there's a vision and goals, and you may have like a big goal you want to reach, whether you get to a point of saying, we want to like 3x the community or whatever, or we now have a number of customer targets or whatever. Once you get to those points, what have you, when you have those goals, I think for the leaders, the functional leaders, it's really important to translate that back. Because, if you have, and I've had this before where it's like, hey, we have this revenue target now, when we're kind of like later stage at some of those startups. And then, but you know what, we have a marketing associate, who's doing something. Maybe they're supporting the community, right? All the community meetups and such. And they're trying to figure out, what does this like $100 million target mean for managing meetups? So in that sense, it's like, I think the thing for the leader is to then break that down. So, hey, for this goal, like, and then across our department, right? Here's all the things that we do, and revenue really breaks out into like back to the funnel, back to engagement. Let's look at things that we want to show that we've moved the needle in this way. Yeah, from the direct touch, the lead stuff is almost always the easiest, right? Because you can say number of leads. We see this part of like, conversions. This is our historically. So then now we can backwards map it. But then you also want to put in all the other stuff. Like we want to change perceptions, or we want this, or we want the community engaged more or differently. And then that way, then it also gives enough room for, and you can be ambiguous on the exact how, right? Because that's where you leave the room for the people on your team to then say like, here's my ideas on how I can get there, right? And how I will show success. Here's the things that we know that work, so we want to double down. And then here are other things that I think we want to try, and giving them that safe space to try.
Awesome. Guys, I don't know where 75 minutes flew by. So this has been an awesome panel, and it's so great to hear you guys share your perspective.